everyone, welcome back to A Little Help for Our Friends. Today's topic is a source of fascination for so many. With The Dropout, the fascination in Elizabeth Holmes, inventing Anna, the explosion in true crime, today's topic is antisocial personality disorder, or what people often casually call psychopathy or sociopathy. So we elicited questions from our followers. We got excellent questions, and we'll aim to answer these as best we can on this episode, given that the research is a little confusing. One thing that's confusing is that we throw around these terms all the time. What's a psychopath? What's a sociopath? Are they the same thing? And then the only thing really noted officially in the DSM is this diagnosis called antisocial personality. So where do these three terms fit together? Kibby, can you give us the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder?
Sure. It's interesting because I think this DSM diagnosis is really heavily weighted on the violent law-breaking qualities, right? So, I mean, just in general for people listening, it's the central features of antisocial personality disorder is irresponsible and violation of rights of others, that lack of empathy, impulsivity, aggressiveness, and the tendency to disregard rights and boundaries of others, right? So it's like criminality. But basically what you have to do in order to meet criteria for this was actually pretty rare. It's about only 3% of the population. You need to have 3 or more of these criteria. Failure to conform to social norms, so failure to obey the law and go to work and do things as you're told. Deceitfulness, so people who tend to lie or con others. Maybe pathologically, like they do it a lot. Impulsivity or don't plan ahead. So people who maybe jump from job to job or relationship to relationship without a long-term planning. They just want things, so they go for it. Irritability and aggressiveness. They're really hot-headed. They tend to react with a lot of anger, a lot of violence towards others. Usually leads to fights or assaults. Reckless disregard for safety of others. So doing things that intentionally hurt themselves or others and they don't even care, like driving fast or running companies to the ground and making people lose their lives and jobs. Consistent irresponsibility, like they don't like to go to school, they don't like to go to work, they constantly renege on their responsibilities. And lack of remorse. So they look like they don't care. That's the lack of empathy piece. They hurt people and they don't seem to care. So I kind of think of this disorder as an extreme goal-oriented person, right? Someone who wants money, drugs, power, and they go for that no matter what, no matter who they hurt, no matter what they destroy. Obviously a lot of these qualities, you can kind of see that it could be successful, right? They could be CEOs of something. But often this diagnosis is, it's really related to people who are not that good at it, who act this way and then end up in jail. So that's a lot of our research is based on people who are in jail, not as much with the, quote unquote, successful people with antisocial personality disorder. And the one last thing that's kind of interesting about this personality disorder is that you have to have met criteria for at least 2 of these or some of these criteria before the age of 15. So this has to actually exist when you're a kid, either aggressiveness or lying or something like that, like bullies, which is weird because all the other personality disorders are diagnosed 18 and upward. And this one has this flavor of the kid, you always were like this. There's something about it that was biological.
Well, the difference, so antisocial personality disorder can only be diagnosed in people 18 and up, but some of these behaviors needed to have been present before age 15. Right. But back then, the diagnosis likely would have been conduct disorder.
Yeah, right.
So
you have to meet criteria for 2 conduct disorder criteria in order to get the full criteria for antisocial. So at least what it says is there needs to be something in childhood.
And then the post-15 symptoms are testing, aggressiveness, lack of remorse, deceitfulness. So more internal processes rather than strictly behaviors.
Yeah, I really like the work by Temi Moffat, one of our beloved professors at Duke, who was really a kind of one of the pioneers in our field, looking at how these disorders develop over time, the nature-nurture question. And by their research, a lot of kids who maybe are bullies or, lie or con when they're younger might grow out of it. Right. But some of them just keep on going. And they say that it might be because kids who get in trouble are just then start to self-select themselves into environments that encourage that. They get into juvie, they hang out with gangs, they hang out with other bullies, and it could keep going until they get to the point where they are criminals. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, I mean, you could see with any of these personality disorders, there could be different types, right? Yeah. Someone who just breaks the law and gets into fights, but they might feel bad about it. Or some people who are just cold-blooded, start a company and screw over others and make it to the top and have a lack of remorse and empathy, but don't break a law. Well, they might, but they might get away with it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so it's important to note that in these diagnoses, we list out a bunch of symptoms, but you don't need to meet all of them to meet criteria. So you could have two people with ASPD that look very different. Yeah. So as you were saying, there could be one person who breaks the law, cons people, and does have a sense of remorse about it, but they keep doing it anyway for whatever reason. Versus you could have another person who's maybe not engaging in as much criminal behavior, but just has no empathy, no remorse for other people. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think differences in psychopathy versus sociopathy can start to emerge. Mm-hmm. But one of the problems is that one of these terms is less well-defined than the other. So, Kibby, how would you define the psychopath?
The psychopath is probably the thing that people think about when they say, oh, they're so antisocial, they're a psychopath, right? Think of Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, or my favorite character of all time is Walt from Breaking Bad, right? So there's two parts to psychopathy, and this is well defined in the research because a professor named Hare, Hare, made a psychopathy checklist. So this is what research is actually really helpful for. This person was like, let me define this, let me make a measure for this, and let's use this in research to really define what we're talking about. So psychopathy is two parts. The first part is the selfish, callous, and remorseless use of others. So people who exploit, who lie, take advantage and don't care, lack of empathy, right? So that's when we say antisocial. That's what we talk about. This kind of like, I use other people and don't care. The other part is the chronically unstable, antisocial, and social deviant lifestyle. So I steal, I don't go to work, but I still hop around to different jobs and maybe drink a lot, use a lot of substances. So they don't follow kind of normal social norms. It's more chaotic than that. Yeah, but as you can see, that definition doesn't necessarily have the criminality or causing fights. It could, but you don't need to. You could have someone like cool and calculated. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an idea, some of the items on this checklist basically are glibness or superficial charm. Mm-hmm. Grandiose sense of self-worth. So actually there seems to be some correlation between psychopaths and narcissists. Proneness to boredom and low frustration tolerance. So then we've got lying and deception, lack of sincerity. And then later you have things like behavior problems, lack of realistic long-term plans, failure to accept responsibility. And we also know that drug and alcohol abuse is very common in people with antisocial personality disorder broadly. And it's also an item on this list. So we see that 80% of people in jail tend to have ASPD, at least that was by one paper that I read, but a much lower percentage seem to score high on this measure of psychopathy level. It's more like 20 to 30%. So you do have a lot of people with ASPD that wouldn't kind of meet this Hare criteria for psychopathy. The ones that do tend to be more impossible to treat, less interested in treatment, but we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, I think this is the part that really gets people or really disturbs people, when you even get a flavor of someone with psychopathy. And you could have a little bit of it, right? With these scales, it's dimensional. So some people can be really high, like a Patrick Bateman, or you could be just have a little bit. And this is the part that's disturbing, because I think that we really take for granted how important social connections are to people, right? Like, you care about others. You don't have to be a bleeding heart therapist, lovey, but you care. If someone's in pain, your empathy is you're supposed to feel a little pain yourself. You want people to like you. You want to get some approval. You want to maintain your relationships, whatever they are. You want to have a nice interaction with someone at the coffee shop. But people with psychopathy, they only care about their goals, which usually is like a power, dominance, money, fame, whatever that is. And they care so much about it that they don't care about your feelings. Mm-hmm. And in some situations, actually helpful. Like, some CEOs have to have that, because in order to drive forward a super big successful company, you got to lay off a bunch of people sometimes. Yeah. And I couldn't do that. That would break my heart to see people lose their jobs and cry and not be able to afford a family. But for people who drive super successul companies, often they might have a touch, if not a lot, of psychopathy. It's just that they don't show up to research studies, so they don't know a lot about it, right? Wouldn't that be cool? But
yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that at a society level, these people are helpful in a way that is keeping them present generation after generation. So there's probably natural selection forces that are keeping these people here for the reasons that you're talking about. There are positions in society where it's important to fuck people over and not care about it. Yeah. You don't want too many of these people running around, and you definitely want checks on them in the form of the rest of society and the legal system. But it's probably adaptive, maybe at a zoomed out level.
Yeah, when I was really interested in empathy research, I was trying to understand, like, do psychopaths not have empathy? And actually, it's more complicated than that. They don't respond emotionally as much as we do to faces and expressions of fear and sadness. It just doesn't react. Like, their amygdalas don't light up. They just don't care. And they might react with more aggression to different faces, so anger faces, right? But they might say, but they have very good, maybe cognitive empathy. So being able to understand other people. So they don't have the emotional empathy, but they might have cognitive empathy. So they get people and they understand that, because that's how they get to their goals. That's how you get the money. That's how you get the power. That's how, the drugs, whatever they want. So they do have empathy, just not the kind you like. And that's helpful in many contexts, right? Maybe in our society, having a lot of money or power or whatever is just adaptive. But there's issues with, like, they can't maintain friends. They can't maintain a family. They don't take care of their kids that well, right? And that could be problematic in general. They have to hop around to person because they can't form those long-lasting relationships. Whether that's important to you, that's another thing, right?
Yeah. So one person had asked over Instagram, how can these people seemingly act with disregard to the consequences? And I would probably adjust that to say they don't act with disregard to the consequences, but they just might be caring about different consequences than you or I would. So I might care about the consequences of another person being hurt. They don't care about that consequence. They care about the consequence of getting away with it and with getting what they want, but they don't care about... And I'm saying this is for a specific slice of the ASPD population, those high in psychopathy and high in callous unemotional traits. They don't care about hurting another person's feelings. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give an example. There's one assessment that I was doing. I've actually had a couple of patients and ex-boyfriends with the antisocial personality disorder, but was someone I was doing an assessment with, this like beautiful girl. With some psychopaths, there's like this coldness it's with the chill in the air. There's like a feel. This is how I feel when I work with them. I'm uncomfortable, and I can't pinpoint why. It feels like a chill deep down in my bones, and that's the only way I can describe it. Based on any research, it's just like feel chilly around them.
Yeah.
And scared. There's a little bit of feeling scared because I think we do get a sense of when someone doesn't have empathy, when someone doesn't smile when you smile. There's this like you're in a room with a predator. So I was with this girl who's like beautiful and just like petite and, like blonde and answered everything great, like very charming. Like I was drawn to her, but also felt scared of her. And I didn't know why because she was answering everything pretty normally. But when we got more into relationships, there was just something off. Like she was just describing how she was just so annoyed with a boyfriend because he was so depressed and he tried to kill himself. And that was just so annoying. And she kept saying it like that, like, ugh. And then I had to, pump his stomach, take him to the hospital. Ugh. And I thought, like, okay, like, she's young. That's kind of a weird way to describe it. But then later on, I was asking the questions about antisocial personality disorder. And I asked, like, when other people are upset, like, how do you feel? And she goes, yeah, well, I know I don't feel anything when that happens, when people are upset. I don't know why. I never did. I always thought that was weird and people thought it was weird. But I learned over time that if I don't act upset when other people are upset, then they're not going to like me. And I'm not going to get what I want. I remember that clearly. I'm not going to get what I want.
Yeah.
And she said, I especially learned how to do that with my family so that they don't kick me out.
Oh my God, I love this person.
I just I felt like my heart froze, right? There's sometimes a sense when people say, like, I don't care about other people's feelings as a defense mechanism. Like, I don't care. Yeah. But I truly felt like she did not care. And she was saying, like, I learned how to care. I learned to look like I care. Yeah. And I was like, oh dear. Like,
well, and that the consequence she was worried about, it wasn't so... When I act this way, people don't like me and I don't like that. It's when they don't like me, then I receive negative consequences.
Yeah,
like
I don't get what I want.
Out. I don't get what I want.
Yeah.
So it's even jumping over the step of just liking other people's company.
Yeah.
Pure goal orientation towards something fairly external, like not connectedness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Mm-hmm. What a prime example. So... I think it could be interesting to bring in sociopathy now so that we can start disentangling them.
Yeah.
The problem
I don't get what that is. I honestly, like, you and I were talking about this before we recorded, and we both were like, what? So,
well, the problem, we don't know. The problem is that with psychopathy, we've got this pretty well-defined checklist. And so when people score high on this checklist, it's kind of like we have a definition of psychopathy. Sociopathy, we don't really have that. And so the research is pretty confusing and says different things. The most consistent things I was seeing were that sociopaths may also score high on this checklist, but the difference seems to be if you take a psychopath, and it's hard because if both people are scoring high on this checklist, then how do you differentiate them? But the theory is that psychopaths are more genetic. They basically come out of the womb with brain abnormalities that are pretty resistant to change. Sociopaths may come out with more normal brains, but they're more environmentally influenced, so you might see a lot more abuse, neglect in their childhood. This becomes further convoluted because there's a gene-environment interaction. So if a kid comes out pretty temperamentally rough, and we see this in BPD as well, except in BPD it's more of like a sensitivity, so they might be very emotional. With this, it might be more aggressive or callous. The parents are not going to react well to that child. So they might act aggressively towards the child, or they might act neglectfully, like, oh, I can't handle this child. Like, this, I just want them to go away. Like, I don't know what to do here. And so then the child gets worse. So one theory is that there might be a difference in origins. Another part may be that psychopaths are more naturally callous. And they do things that are maybe a bit more premeditated and goal-oriented versus a sociopath is more reactive and emotional and very sensitive to things like humiliation and shame. And this might be because when they were a child, they were treated with aggression, abuse, and humiliation. And so that becomes kind of like a core psychic threat. And so they might react aggressively towards perceived slights. And if you look at the ASPD criteria, you have one criteria is this aggressiveness, and a whole other one is lack of remorse. And so you could have either or, with a lack of remorse trending more towards psychopath and the aggressiveness trending more towards sociopaths.
So we might just scrap talking about, and also, to be upfront, the research was kind of all over the place with these definitions. So I think that's a problem of we don't know how to treat them well. We don't know how to do a lot of research on them well because these definitions are kind of more vague and loose. But maybe we could talk, instead of say there's psychopaths and sociopaths, maybe we could talk about them as traits, right? That people with ASPD tend to have. But it seems like sociopathy is a little bit more aggressiveness, violence, law-breaking, impulsivity, and psychopaths are more of the interpersonal, deceit and manipulativeness and the lack of remorse. Is that how we're thinking about this?
I mean, potentially. It seems like psychopaths might commit violence for different reasons. They might commit violence because it's entertaining to them or because it is in service of a goal, but it's maybe more thought out and methodical.
Yeah, like Patrick Bateman. Who's the real life example. Patrick Bateman was murdering people who were the competition, was getting in his way of something like that. And it was also, there seemed to be some kind of a sick pleasure in hurting people.
Right.
Versus maybe Walt in Breaking Bad was backed into a corner in a fight and he would do something violent.
And you see Walt tended to, the whole ending of that was based on him having some sort of moral compass or remorse, right? I mean, he's with the...
Yes, but I wouldn't give it away because it's one of the best endings in TV history, according to my opinion. But yes, I mean, I think that's the thing. That's the problem when you're dealing with these people. It's you want people to have remorse. You want to search for their kernel of empathy or compassion or something. The times I've worked with them, I was digging for it. With this girl I was assessing, I was but don't you feel bad when your brother is hurting, right? You want them to have that. And you don't know all the time if they're literally born with this learning deficit of emotional connection, or is it that they're defensively hiding it because they've been abused for so long, right? Yeah. So you don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. I think so. Another interesting divide in ASPD is that I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but it's something like half show pretty low or normal levels of anxiety. The other half are very high anxiety, which you wouldn't necessarily expect from this colloquial term psychopath. When we think of psychopaths, we think of cold and unemotional. And that does, so those higher checklist people tend to be the less anxious half of the ASPD population versus and again, we can drop this term, but maybe what we're thinking of as sociopath, you're seeing much more anxious, depressed people there. And so they might be reacting more from a place of emotion, actually. So it's not that they're unemotional. They may have lack of mentalization processing. So they might have lower empathic relating, like you were talking about. But they still have high emotions in themselves. So high capacity for shame, for instance. High capacity for anger.
I see. Okay. So, yeah, I guess we could be a little careful with throwing around the terms of it's just sociopath, psychopath. They're a little bit different things. And it's a little bit hard to define. I'll give another story that popped in my mind. This is super embarrassing. But I was just thinking when we're talking about kids showing psychopathy, I was looking at some old childhood videos of mine. And
oh my god, yes, I love this story.
Oh god, so embarrassing. But hopefully I'm not a sociopath now. But I looked, or a psychopath now. See, I'm even.
You are so far from being a psychopath.
Good. There was a video of me in this play group, where, those gym play groups with kids, the little toddlers running around on jungle gyms and monkey bars and all that stuff. Well, I gotta be 2 years old or something, 2 or 3. And I'm trying to reach up to this monkey bar so badly. Like, you could see me for like a few minutes reaching and trying to go on my tippy toes and try to step on this. And then I'm so frustrated. I'm so frustrated. And then you see this little boy toddling behind me. And without even looking at him, I'm staring at the bar, but I grab him and I throw him down on the floor. And I step on him to be able to reach up to the bar. And you see my mom swoop in and go, no, and just like pull me off this little boy. And I've since buried that video. It's not to be seen by anyone else. But I remember thinking to myself, like, oh my God, if I saw this kid, I would think that I'm a psychopath. But that's the kind of behavior you're talking about here.
Yes. And... So you don't terrify parents who have 2-year-olds that are acting like mafia members. Exactly. Mentalization ability develops around the age of 4. So when you were 2, you were probably incapable of understanding that kid might feel humiliated by that action.
Thank you, science.
It's actually cool. So this does not count as a scientific study, but when I was in undergrad, we basically had to do like it was a class that was like teaching us how to begin thinking about observational studies, and I took it in kind of more of a quantitative approach, but I didn't have a big enough sample size. But basically, I was looking at this idea of sympathetic sharing. So like, when does something like altruism develop? And that does seem to be around the age of 4. And so I set up this paradigm where I would have 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds come into the room, and I'd give them stickers. So they'd all be happy with their little stickers. And then I had 2 sheep stuffed animals. And one of them was Hal and one of them was Sal. And Hal was just so happy, and he was having the best time with his toys, and he's just playing with everyone in the playground. Oh my God, life is great. And then Sal was just so sad, and all his toys were broken, and nobody wanted to play with him, and he was just so sad, and he didn't know what to do. And then I asked the kids if any of them would like to share their stickers, and if so, who they would like to share with. And more of the 4-year-olds shared with Sal, who was like probably lamer and less fun to play with, but it indicated a sense of like, oh, I can make this sheep feel better by giving him my stickers versus the happy fun one. So things like altruism, sympathetic sharing, that kind of thing happens around the age of 4, unless you're a psychopath.
Good to know. Yeah, so parents out there, don't worry if your kid throws another child on the floor in order to get the monkey bars. But if they keep doing it...
If they keep doing it past the age of 4.
Get them into a business school,
Yeah, they'll slay with the ladies if you just put them into business school. Okay, so...
Another question? We could take another question?
We could take and I'll just say, the last thing on this note is one paper was saying that the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths, again, I think we're going to drop these terms, but psychopaths tend to have no remorse. Sociopaths might have remorse, but it's more towards an in-group. So they're very, very connected with their gang or their family or something like that. Or maybe not very, very connected, but that's kind of who they're caring about more than the psychopaths who are caring about themselves. That's a possible distinction. Again, this research is pretty sticky. So one thing I kind of want to make the point of is that, like, I think it's an interesting discussion to have about this diagnosis being kind of a legal term, because it's not, I mean, one of the papers was just making this case that, like, there's a little bit of a lack of, like, internalized, like, psychological processes. We are seeing it, though, somewhat with, like, the lack of remorse and deceitfulness. But I just think it's interesting to think that a lot of people in adverse environments like gangs could easily get this diagnosis, or more easily get this diagnosis, when that could be the sort of sociology of, like, the culture that they're in. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's blaming the individual instead of the system, where a lot of psychopaths or people who are violent because maybe they've grown up in dangerous environments, or like with gangs, or that's the only options they have, right? Which is obviously biased to certain socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds, which is awful. Yeah.
I mean, and a gang could have a culture of violence where it's acceptable, right? And probably bringing down remorse. And I mean, the military can do this too, right? Like the military is designed to allow people to act violently and without remorse, because remorse is not a good thing when you need to kill people for your job, you know? So it's just, and like, if you think of, maybe this is less likely than military, but if you think of like gangs or something, maybe you've acted violently before the age of 15 because you were extremely poor and so you were shoplifting. You were modeled, you know, a certain kind of behavior. Maybe you feel at odds with the rest of society because you feel like the rest of society has been unjust towards you, or that you've been born into naturally unfair circumstances. So it's just, I think it's important, as I think we're about to talk about treatment, to think about what this diagnosis really means and how very different people could be slotted into it.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So, a couple questions on, can you confirm that this cannot be treated, or can this be treated? And the answer is complicated.
It's complicated. The researcher we're looking at says that it's hard to tell, especially with all these different definitions, right? Like, who are you treating here? I do see that people who have high psychopathy, who are psychopaths, you know, whatever you want to say, tend to be harder to treat. But in general, when you have someone coming in for ASPD, when they want, most of the time people don't walk into your office being like, treat my antisocial personality disorder. Usually it's like court ordered or brought in by someone else so they can stop breaking the law or hurting other people. So already people come in not wanting this treatment, right? They don't see themselves as the problem. They have no remorse, right? People who have high psychopathy tend to be dangerous. So people who are therapists get really nervous about working with these people who might do things that are like ruthless. They might assault people. They might, sexually or physically or emotionally, and they, feel comfortable treating that. So it's tough. And also there's a lot of worry of risk with treatment. So they might not be great for, talk therapy. The thing that you can have leverage on as a therapist is that you might have buy-in. We call it buy-in if someone wants to engage in treatment. If you agree that, you want to help them stop their rule breaking or violation of laws, especially if it helps them get something that they want, right? Like, I'll help you stop breaking the law if it allows you to get custody over the children, or it keeps you out of jail, right? Or gets you the job that you really want, right? There's a little bit more buy-in with people, with patients with antisocial personality disorder. And it's tough because then there's a lot of power dynamics. The times I've worked with people with some antisocial personality disorder, it's always about, they don't like authority. They don't like someone with power over them. So they're constantly challenging you. They're breaking rules. They're coming late. They're not paying for the therapy. They're being mean to you. Like, it's a real power struggle, and therapists have to learn to not get into that power struggle, but it's really tough because the way we learn to work is through the connection, right? Like making a bond, having a therapeutic alliance, and they are fighting that. Or they just don't care about you. They want what they want, and they don't care that you're scared that they're going to hurt somebody, right?
One of the treatments I read said that people high on the psychopathy checklist almost shouldn't be treated because they may just learn new tricks for manipulating other people.
Ooh, yikes. I did have a patient that I learned over time had ASPD. He had a lot of other stuff too. He had a really hard life, was abused and was in the army. So, I don't blame him, but he came in with that cold chill feeling, right? He came in and was like, "Oh, I'm having such a hard time. There's a lot of substance abuse in ASPD." So he was talking about how he's getting over substance abuse issues and really wants to get into treatment because he wants to reunite with his wife. And it was just, like sad. And he was like, I'm really working on being more vulnerable. So he'd look at me with these big eyes and cry. But there was And usually that would just get me. But there was something about it that I had to look away. Like I felt disgusted when he cried. It felt performative. It felt almost aggressive. It was like aggressive sadness. He was like, I feel so ashamed, and would look me dead in the eye and cry. And it's just, I don't know. It was so disturbing. And I find out over time, so I'm working on these skills with him, how to, work with his emotions, learn how to validate, learn how to like listen to her and whatever. And I learned over time, through working with other providers that he's worked with, that he has lied to everybody. And he was actually way more violent towards her than he ever told me. So he was saying that she kicked him out of the house for the drug abuse. And then I find out that he actually assaulted her. Yeah. And this is a common thing with treating ASPD, is like this feeling of betrayal and anger and, like this, like, I thought we had a trust, but he didn't care. He wanted to get into treatment to, keep his job, keep his family, and stay off drugs because it was a problem. Yeah. But he didn't care about the same things as I cared about, which is like actually connecting to his wife. So it's tough. Like they could still be treated for things like that, right? To check certain behaviors, but not everything.
I mean, it seems like the presence of mentalization or empathy seems really important for how treatable these people are. Mm-hmm. I mean, this paper we were reading was recommending like a group therapy, because in a group you can more easily see the effects of your words or behaviors on others, and so mentalization can potentially increase. It also had a line about the therapist. You should probably expect authority issues, but in a way, the therapist can serve almost a reparenting role, where the ASPD person can act out their rebelliousness against a safe, parental figure. I mean, again, like, there are high rates of comorbidity with anxiety and depression and substance use. All three of those are treatable. And so potentially bringing some of that down. I mean, alcohol use, cocaine use, etc. I mean, that's going to raise impulsivity, right? So if some of this behavior is actually kind of mediated by substance use, then potentially treating some of that might bring down some of the criminal or violent behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I know that mentalization-based therapy, which is originally for people with borderline personality disorder, it's developed by Fonagy and Bateman, two really fantastic British psychologists who basically work on your mentalization or your empathy and perspective-taking skills. They've adapted MBT for people with antisocial personality disorder, and they mostly do it in like prison settings. So it might not be only psychopaths, but it might be people who are like violent, impulsive, and end up in jail. Yeah. But they've had some success, and it is a lot of like it's a group setting, and it's a lot of like they're challenging each other and then discussing what's happening. It's fascinating. So I think they had some success, but that's one therapy that I know is trying to tackle this problem.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it seems like for people who are more callous and unemotional, one conduit towards at least bringing down the criminal behavior could be using a more goal-directed approach of, it will help you get what you want faster if you cut this shit out. Mm-hmm. And then for other people with mentalization capacities, mentalization-based therapy, maybe like a mentalization-based group therapy could be helpful. I know DBT there's been attempts there. Mm-hmm. And then potentially bringing down the comorbid diagnoses, so that if people are acting because of substance abuse, because of high anxiety, basically having negative emotions that they can't stand, and so they'll do anything to bring down those negative emotions. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we talked about this with BPD and shame, but if you feel humiliated and you can't stand that and you have low empathy, you're just going to react violently, because it's like, right. I want that cause of my humiliation exterminated. Yeah. But if you have a lower capacity to jump to humiliation, then perhaps we could circumvent that process. Mm-hmm. Last question. Basically, what do you do if your loved one has antisocial personality disorder? And one person said, how do you forgive yourself for having loved someone with ASPD? So, Kibby, if you have some experience with this.
I love the way that's phrased, how to forgive yourself. That just like answers everything right there, right? It's kind of like you really, if you love someone with antisocial personality or like with psychopathy, it's hard because they're charming. Mm-hmm. You want to get at a vulnerable part. You want to get that connection, and they might like lure you in with it and then pull it away, right? So it's tough. I remember feeling that it was such a draw, and then you feel stupid when you're tricked or something like that, or they betray you, or they break a rule and they get in trouble. You feel stupid over and over again. So there is a lot of forgiveness that has to happen. Mm-hmm. I had an old boyfriend. I really hope he isn't listening. But I had an old boyfriend who, my own safety. No, I'm kidding. Who I just didn't understand what this was. I didn't get what was happening. Very, very smart, very handsome, very clever. Got what he wanted all the time, of course. And would just lie about really weird things. Like, we got into a fight once, and something he did hurt my feelings. I won't go into that, but it was just really, he was like manipulating me into doing something I wasn't comfortable with, and I got upset. And I talked to him on the phone about it. I was like, that really like was terrible and violated my boundaries. I said it probably not as eloquently. I was like 15. And he was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that I did this to you. I'm so mad at myself. I'm going to hurt myself." And he told me he like broke his heel on glass because he was so upset that he hurt me. And I was distraught, right? I was like, no, it's okay. It's okay. I'm not that upset, right? I took it back. And he was like, "Oh, okay. Like, I just really care about you," right? And then like a week later, he showed me the scar on his foot, and he was like, this is where I did it. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking to myself, it was only a couple days later, I was like, you can't develop a scar that fast after hurting yourself. Like, that was a weird lie. And I confirmed that it was a lie from his mom, who was like, what? He didn't do that. And I remember thinking, that's so weird. And he would just have really strange humor. Like, he would make me upset and laugh. Like, one time I was on a plane to visit him, and when I got there, he was like, "Oh, I just imagined the plane crashing." And I laughed and I started to cry. And he was like, and he genuinely looked at me and said, "Why are you crying? Isn't that funny?"
My God.
And not even sarcastic. He was like, "I'm sorry. What did I say? Wasn't that funny?" And I remember being like, "Oh God, like this is," and the real true moment was we were visiting, we're abroad. If I give away the details, you'll know who it is. But we were abroad, and I was just like admiring this beautiful view, and there's all these little animals around, these like, there's little hedgehogs running around, and little like squirrels and stuff like that. And I was like, "Oh, look at a hedgehog. I've never seen one." He was like, "Oh, okay, thanks." Takes a shovel, picks up the hedgehog, flings it over the fence down a cliff.
I mean,
and I scream bloody murder. I'm distraught. And he looks at me again with the same look, and he's like, "Are you okay? What happened? What's wrong?" I was like, "You killed this thing." He was like, "Yeah. Well, what? Yeah, of course. I don't want them in my yard." It's that picture. I will never forget that picture that I thought, "Oh my God, there's something wrong with him." There's something wrong with him. Yeah. And it was like that all his life, and I think he's a very successful businessman right now. And
oh my God. Well, and the trick he played on you with
oh my God. Yeah. That was a hard part. That was really oh God. Okay, so we are also on the same trip. We get into a huge argument. And he calls his mother and says in a different language something that I didn't understand, but he's speaking in another language, and what he says, as I translated later, was she broke my nose. And like, I didn't know what was happening in the moment. We were fighting and crying, and he gets off the phone. He was like, "Okay, my mom has booked you a flight tomorrow, and she wants you to leave, and I never want to see you again." I was like, "I'm so sorry. Oh my God. Like, I'm so sorry." And I'm crying and begging, and he leaves. He leaves me in a hotel by myself. in this foreign land, and I'm all alone. I'm scared. I feel like I ruined our family's relationship. And the next day, I'm still sobbing. We pack up my bag. We start to head to the airport. And then as soon as we're about to get to the airport, he turns around and goes, I lied. I didn't call my mother. Let's go back and enjoy the rest of our trip.
That's chilling.
Yeah, it's chilling. And I don't know why I did it. Just for punishing, just to watch me suffer. I'm not sure, but to get the power back, I don't know. But that's a psychopath. And how do you forgive yourself? I think it took me a while, because I think that the psychopath, people who don't take accountability or have remorse for their own actions will make you feel bad, right? They put the accountability on you. And so for a while, I felt I was crazy. I felt like I was broken. I was making these things happen. I was young. I was confused. And it took a while for me to learn that I'm not, I don't know, whatever I thought I was. Yeah.
He did that in a couple of different tricky ways. I mean, the first thing he did, it turned out to be a lie, but instead of, when you said that he upset you, you were upset, instead of saying, oh, I'm so sorry for what I did, he moved to, I'm a horrible person who needs to be punished, which then elevates or escalates, the situation to a point where you are forced to give up being upset with him because it's more important to comfort him and bring him back down to earth. And this happens all the time with like a number of different, we could have talked about this in the vulnerable narcissism episode. People who, instead of apologizing for their behavior, say, I'm just so pathetic. I just hate myself. I'm such a terrible person. It forces the person who is initially upset to start comforting them and to release their own emotions. So he did it that way. And then he did it through, again, escalating things to such a point where if you wanted to maintain any sort of stability or continuity in your own life, you again had to release being upset with him and focus on, how can I fix myself? How can I make this right? So that I can stay in this foreign country where I'm safe, stay in this relationship that I've been in, not turn an entire family against me.
Yeah,
I mean,
it all felt like, looking back, it all felt like a power play, right?
Yeah.
All different things to put me in a place where I'm controlled and I'm wrong and I'm too scared to
keep you obedient.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was still good at either acting or maybe in his own way felt bad when I was upset, but reacted to it in such strange ways, right? Like that it was just not right. And it took me years to forgive myself. I had a really hard time. And I think I just learning about psychopathy and learning about these traits, and they're just fundamentally different. They care about different things. They don't have the same form of empathy that we do. Because if I thought that he did, in some ways it seems crazier. Like it puts them in a sphere of humanity that I feel like I know and understand, and he like overcame empathy to hurt me. But if you don't have it, it's almost kind of like that person is like an alien, right? Yeah. So it's like I had to think of him as like a person who's just fundamentally like almost like had a learning disability for like human emotions. And that's a way I could forgive myself and maybe him in a way. I
mean, I think it's hard, especially for highly empathic individuals, to understand that there are some people who are just missing. It's like people who, can't see part of the color spectrum or are missing a sense. It can be hard for us to understand what that's like and to imagine that. And so it also might feel bad to the empathic person to say, oh, you're a monster or an alien. Like, I think the empath is going to want to assume human characteristics.
Right.
And goodness to another person. When you said you had to forgive yourself, though, what was the anger towards yourself that you were holding?
I didn't understand what it was, so I thought all of the problems were my fault. And I take accountability. I definitely was like hot-headed and kind of chaotic back then, especially with issues at home and stuff like that. So definitely a lot of our fights would be, I put it on myself, that I am like, this is my fault. I made him hurt his foot. I made him do these things. Because he would say, it's your fault. Right? And I think, especially if you're young or don't know yourself well, you're kind of and you're learning about yourself in relationships, right? Especially early ones. So if you date or love a psychopath, you're forming part of your sense of self through that. Yeah. And it's so distorted that I had to live my life and date other people and connect to people who really cared about me to get to a place where I could forgive myself. So,
I think it's interesting, especially when you're young. This is a half-baked thought, so I don't know if it's even worth saying, but when we are children, when we do bad things, it's usually said to be our fault. Parents are rarely apologizing for their own behavior or taking accountability for dynamics, at least maybe in prior generations. And so I wonder if we're kind of trained to accept more blame than to dole out in a lot of situations. And so it can be maybe more believable when somebody says that's your fault.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because then you have to question everything. You have to question that person's humanity. You have to question your love for them, and the love was real, you know? So it was just easier for me to be like, oh, because it's under my control if something's wrong with me, right? If it, otherwise the terror that person was just that sadistic and uncontrollable, and there's nothing I could do about it. It's just too much. So yeah. And
I think it's important to realize these people in some ways are well trained to manipulate you. The superficial charm, the higher cognitive empathy. So, the ability, and that probably facilitates an accelerated learning process when you don't actually care about other people's feelings. You can experiment more with people and learn more about various consequences and how to manipulate, how to get your way. So, they're well trained. And they probably seem exciting and mysterious. How can I get them to connect? How can I get them to love me? I seem to have it in the beginning. Oh my God, our relationship is exciting. So there's a lot of pull here, I think.
Yeah, I think when we have, we're giving tips to you guys, like if you have a loved one with antisocial personality disorder, is if you can, I really set boundaries, very strict boundaries, and keep yourself safe. And forgive yourself. These are one of these things that there's not much you can do to change them in the moment, right? And you might be hoping that there is a conscience. You might be hoping there's empathy, and if they only cared about you enough, it would be enough for them to stop doing what they're doing. But you got to relieve yourself of that. Yeah. Of that trap of thinking.
Right. Okay. Well, I love this discussion, and I feel like we'll probably have more. But for now, any resources?
Yeah, I really like this book. It's by Dr. Robert Hare, the person I talked about who made the psychopathy checklist. So he has a book that you could get on Amazon or wherever. It's called Without Conscious, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. That sounds good.
Creepy title.
So, yeah, go for that book, or we'll link a couple of other of the research that we're talking about here on our website, so you could check that out there.
Okay, well, guys, if any of you do have empathy and you want to make us feel better, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Otherwise, you're basically a psychopath. And we'll see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval.